introduce the speaker, let me just quickly tell you about this event. So this event is being recorded, and then the recording will be available right after the event ends. And then I will also upload this the video to YouTube. Also, I should say my name is Max Katz. Again, if you attended previous events, then you know me. But in case this is your first time, I lead community for Okta Workflows. So again, it's being recorded. There will be a link on YouTube. I will also send a follow-up message with links and resources and after the event. So later today or maybe tomorrow. And if you have any questions, there is chat, so you can put messages in chat. There's also a separate Q&A section where you can put questions there as well. And then we should have time at the end. We will answer those questions. I think I covered everything. So now today, it's a sort of special event. In previous talks, it was just me, but today we have a guest speaker, Gray Thrasher, and he is a senior technical marketing manager at Okta, and he's going to tell you about Okta Workflows Connector Builder. So Gray, welcome to our online meetup.
Thank you, Max. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. All right. Well, you already introduced me, so I won't take any more time with that, but it's nice to see you all online here. So today I'm going to cover a new offering that we recently GA'd called Okta Workflows Connector Builder. First I'll show our obligatory legal statement there. So I think everything I'm going to cover today is generally available. If I happen to mention anything that might be future looking, obviously this just states that that's not a commitment. We can't be held to that. So got that out of the way there. I'm going to start kind of at the 30,000 foot level and quickly descend down into the nuts and bolts of the workflow connector builder. And hopefully by the end of this, what we'll do is we'll have built out a custom workflow connector, or maybe two of them. But just kind of keep it informal, and we'll jump around a little bit. At one point, might do a little quick poll to see what everybody's interested in, and might kind of try to tailor things according to that. But first of all, I'm assuming everybody knows what Okta Workflows is. I think Max has held a few of these, but just for those that, in case anybody isn't real familiar with that, it's Okta's no-code drag and drop automation platform. So little picture on the right there. It consists of some sort of event at the beginning that will trigger the workflow. So whether that's a scheduled, just runs on a schedule, or maybe some action took place within an application, and that will trigger the workflow. In this picture here, we got an API endpoint, so maybe some applications calling with webhooks over to the Okta workflow there, or maybe it's just a workflow you've delegated to users to be able to trigger manually. So starts with an event, and then you have some sort of functions that might do data manipulation or affect the way the workflow traverses. And then you have application actions. So the actions are on application connectors. So we have a bunch of different built-in connectors that can be used for third-party applications out there. And those contain the actions. So this is what a connector looks like on the screen here. What it does is it connects to an application. Here we see the Slack application connector, and the action for this one happens to be send message to channel. A lot of the connectors and actions have options and inputs and outputs. So in this case, the input would be in the message section, some sort of text that you want to send to a Slack channel, and what you get back is the output, and that's a timestamp of when it was sent. So this is essentially what we will be building out. We're not going to be building it against Slack, but this is kind of the end goal here. So why would we want to build a custom connector? So we've seen kind of a few different reasons why a custom connector might need to be built. So typically homegrown applications. So if a customer has Okta Workflows and they have some sort of homegrown application, obviously there's not going to be a pre-built application connector in Okta Workflows for that. So it would be a private application for private use within a customer's Okta org. Another option would be if the customer is using an application, a third-party public application, but we don't yet have a connector for that within Okta Workflows. So if somebody was using, using the Slack example, if we didn't happen to have a Slack connector already in there, the customer could build out a connector against that Slack app, but just for their private use. That wouldn't make it generally available to other customers. It would be just in their own org there. And then the last would be is if you're an application developer and you wanted to make your application available to Okta Workflows. So you could build out a workflow connector and then submit that to Okta to be included within the Workflows connector catalog. So that would be for public use there. So I think, Max, if we have that first poll, just kind of to get a feel for which one of these buckets everybody might be in there, if we could just send that out. And
yeah, let me show it.
Okay, thanks. I don't know, am I able to see that?
Are you? It's not. I enabled it, but it's not.
That is okay. We don't necessarily. I'm just curious, but also, we can kind of tailor the conversation according to that. But that's fine. That's fine if the poll's not working. So
I'm gonna try. I'll try as you feel free to continue, and I'll try to figure this out.
Okay, no worries. So just to do a high level of what it takes to build out a custom connector, and this is probably one of the last slides before we actually jump into the building one in a live demo. So there's a few basic configuration settings that need to be set up when you first create your connector. There's a settings section, and this is essentially the branding of your connector. So it'd be the name that's going to be shown for your connector, a description. You can add an icon and what color badge you want that's kind of used behind the icon on the connector itself. And then any links to the documentation for the connector and a contact. So in case there's any issues with it. So if this is going to be used internally only, obviously the documentation URL could be an internal link and an internal email address. For application vendors that want this included in the workflow connector catalog, this would obviously have to be a public URL and then some sort of support email address that external users would be able to send messages to. The next would be to set up the authentication type. And we have 4 different options there. One is none, no authentication required. We have basic, so essentially a username, password, base64 encoded, and included in a basic authorization header. We have a custom option, so that would be for anything outside the bounds of none, basic, or the 4th one there, OAuth 2. Typically, this would be for something like an API key. And then the 4th one, like I said, there is OAuth 2.0. That's the most common one we see from customers, and this would be using like a client ID, client secret, setting some scopes and things like that. And then we have the option to add some parameters and config values. And those would be to allow for the end user that's making use of the connector to be able to provide information. So putting in a client ID and a client secret, or maybe a tenant name or something for a specific instance of the application you wanted to connect to. And then the basic building blocks within the connector itself is we'd start off with a helper flow called an HTTP helper flow. This essentially takes the authentication and whatever else needs to be passed in to make a connection to the remote endpoint, an API on a remote resource. And just like with Okta Workflows, this is a typical helper flow that other flows will be able to call. This would be confined to the connector itself, but we'll see this is essentially used in every other flow that we're going to be creating here. The next flow is a system flow that needs to be created called _auth ping. This is a special flow that the connector will look for to check the health of the connection. So if you've ever set up a connection within Okta Workflows, you need to enter your information, make sure it actually authenticates and connects before it allows you to make use of the connector. For things like OAuth 2.0, your access token might expire, so this would also be used to help refresh that token. And then the last flow or sets of flows would be your action flows. These are what gets exposed on the connector when you're making use of them within Okta Workflows. So in that picture we saw before of the Slack connector, it said send message to channel. That would be an action flow there. So typically you might start with a custom API action, and that would essentially be like a generic action where users could enter maybe a request method, an API endpoint, and whatever data they wanted to put in there. And that's kind of a blank slate for an application where you could call any valid API there. So we'll build out one of those, and then maybe some more specific flows where the end user making use of the connector doesn't need to be all that familiar with the underlying APIs. All right, so let's build our first custom connector here.
So great. So the question was shown. I think just folks needed to click on there's a little graph icon, but I can read you quickly just the numbers. So we have about 14% voted for the first option, which is homegrown. The most 65% almost for the third-party application. 7% we are application vendor, and this is my favorite. Almost 15% voted for the free beer.
All right, awesome. Although unfortunately we are all out of beer, so. Yeah. Oh, so and then there was another poll too.
Yeah, I mean, do you want me to show it now?
Might as well. And then if you could just let me know what
Sure.
we get from that, because we'll start building out. The first flow we're going to build is going to use no authentication, so we'll start with that, and then we'll tweak that to add some authentication to it, just to show, maybe going from the simplest iteration to more complex and more common.
Sounds good. So I just made it public. And again, folks, I think you need to click, there's a little icon of a bar on the right-hand side. If you click there, and then you can vote. And the only thing, there's no beer in this question.
All right.
Cool.
So we're in the Workflows Designer here. For anybody that doesn't know, from the admin console, you can go to Workflows and then click on Workflow Console. And here, you should see a button in the upper right called Connector Builder. That's a GA now, so I believe everybody should have that has access to workflows. Once clicking on that, it should bring you to something that looks similar to the Workflow Designer, and that's the Connector Builder Designer here. So what we'll do is we'll build our first connector. To do that, we'd click on the plus up here, and we'd give it a name. You want to give it, obviously, a name that makes sense for whatever application this connector will connect to. So I'm just going to call this, I'll just call this demo app. And then a description here. Go ahead and save that. And then this brings up your configuration screen for your custom connector. The first thing we want to do is jump into the settings. We'll click edit over here. We've got our name in here, and then it's got a unique identifier key here. So you can go back and you can change the name of this, and it won't ruin anything under the covers there. But for anything we do in here or in the authentication, we can see a preview of what it's going to look like over on the right. So here we can see it's got kind of a pink background and one of the default icons there. We can obviously change those. So I'll give it a different color. I don't have an icon to upload, but in order to do that, you can just click replace and then select whatever icon you might want to use there. The description is, you'd want to make sure to include something that is representative of what this connector is for, what application you're going to connect to, and maybe some of the actions that might be available, because these will be included in the indexing in the connector catalog. So if somebody searches on, the right set of text, it'll find it there. And again, user documentation, support contact email at the bottom there, but you can see the preview over there. So we'll go ahead and save that. And then we'll jump into authentication. I'll just show you this really quick, but for this first one, we'll do this with no authentication. In here, you have the different auth types. So basic, we'll add username and password. OAuth 2.0, you get more things like the base URL for your, at least the authentication path for your APIs, and then the subpaths here for the authorization to get an auth token or an access token, and then how to retrieve that token, or the auth path would be to authorize and then authenticate, the token path, and then the refresh token path, and then you have some other things below. We'll get back to this in a second because this is one of the more advanced ones we'll build out towards the end. And then custom, which doesn't give you anything except the option to add some parameters, so you can add really whatever you need in case you have some authentication requirements that are outside the bounds of basic or OAuth 2. So for this one, we're doing none. So that's what's selected there. And then now we'll get into our flows. So again, the first flow we're going to create is a helper flow that all the other flows are going to make use of to actually connect to that application. So in here, we'll just add the event of a helper flow. And what we want from this is, again, to make an HTTP call out to our APIs. So the add function here, and let me increase this a little bit. I'm not sure if you're able to see it too well there. So we're going to, with the HTTP raw request card, this will make the call out to our application. For some applications, to be able to have the different actions call different API endpoints. So, so we'll do that here for this one. So here I will add just essentially a base URL for our endpoint. I'm going to be making use of a free API called randomuser.me that doesn't require any authentication. And I'll keep it like this for right now. We want to be able to dynamically pass in different parameters to our call here. So if I kept get in here, the only thing we could do with this flow is make get calls, but we might want to do a post or a put or something like that. So for our helper flow, we'll add some input fields to be able to pass those in dynamically from the other workflows. So maybe a relative URL field, so we can call the different endpoints on this API. The request method, and then maybe headers, query, and body if we need to pass in some additional things there. So headers, query, body, and these would be objects. And then here, we pass the relative URL field here, so we can build out the full URL to the API endpoint we want to call. I'll just give these some user-friendly names. You don't have to do this, but it is a good practice to get into, so you don't lose track of which output is coming from where. So we'll build out that full URL from the base URL and whatever's passed into this flow for the relative URL. Put that over there. Request method, replace that so we can dynamically set that from any of the workflows that are calling this helper flow. And our headers, query, and body, in case any of those need to come in there. And then what we want to return from this is really anything that's coming back from this. Don't always need the status code headers and body for all the different actions there, but they're good for debugging. And then for our auth ping flow, we definitely want the status code there so we can make sure our connection is successful. And I'm just going to change this body to an object because typically we'll be getting back like a JSON object or something. I'll go ahead and save this and call this HTTP helper. And I'll leave out the description for now just so we can save some time. And we want to make sure to save the data that passes through here just so we can debug this in case we're having any issues. So just to run a quick test, I don't have a connection yet, so I'm going to create a connection. There's no authentication, so it's just going to have me give it a name. So I'll just give it a name here. And then the parameters that I have configured over on the left on the event card here, I need to pass those in. So the relative URL I know for randomuser.me is /API. And I'm going to do a get on there. I'm not going to pass any additional headers, query your body. I'll run the test. We got a status code 200 back. That's a good sign. And then just check the body of it. And here we got some data back. And that's the data that I would expect. So we're good to go on that helper flow there. It's switched to on. We've got it saved with the name. We've got our first helper flow there. Now we want to build the flow that's going to test the health of our connection, the auth ping flow. So again, it needs to be named auth ping, and we'll save the data there. And here the event is an auth ping type. So even though this does look a lot like the workflow designer, when you get into some of the nuts and bolts, like creating an event for it, it is a little bit different than the workflow designer. For instance, you wouldn't see auth ping as an option for an event over in the workflow designer there. So we'll click auth ping, and all this does is provides us the connection object. So if there was any authentication parameters in there, those would be available as well. And what we want to do here is, again, make a call out to our API and make sure that that call doesn't fit. Here is add a if error card in the error handling section here. And in our try block, we're going to try to make a call out to our flow. So we use the flow control call flow card and select our HTTP helper flow. And then we can just add the information that that's required. Typically, in the auth ping flow, you want to make a call out to your API that's going to be quick and return as little data as possible, because this is going to be used to test the connection. It's not going to be used to really do anything with that data. So you wouldn't want to make a call out to an API that's going to take 30 seconds and return 1,000 records, because that could bog things down. You could get some false negatives and things like that. So here I'm just going to call that API, do a get, and then I know some of the information I want to get out of here is the status code. That's a number. And I can get the headers and body, but just leave it as status code for right now. And then if it's successful, the try block assumes this is success. I want to use the flow control assign card and just create a little message that says connection successful or something, just so we know what's going on. And then in our outputs here, we want to return two things: status code and that message. So I'll drag the message over here and the status code up here. And this is assuming it was successful. So in our if error block, we'll add the status code here. And bring that up here, and our message down here. And then now we're setting status code and message based off of whether it was successful or had an error. And ultimately we want to, we're going to provide some data over to this return status card, which has a Boolean field, whether or not it was working, and then a service response, which is going to have that status code and the message in an object there. So we'll build those out right now. So we'll add a true false card, compare. We'll take the status code and say if this is equal to 200, which is a typical success HTTP code there, and then that'll return a Boolean value. We'll drag that over to the working field here. And then we're going to build an object with the object construct card that'll contain status code and then a body that will contain the message. And we will drag that over to the service response. Save that, and we'll give this a quick test. We have our test connection that we created when we were doing the HTTP helper card. We'll just run a quick test. That 200 equals true. We got our build out that object there, and we can see this is returning true with our service response. So essentially, this is what the connector connection will be using to make sure that any credentials you have stored in there, API keys, things like that, that the connector is still able to communicate with the application when it's being used in workflows. Okay, so we have our two basic flows that are kind of the foundation of the connector there. Now we'd be ready to create our first action flow. And to do that, again, we'll ultimately call that helper flow so we can make a call out to our remote application. But what do we want to actually pass into this? So in order to expose this on our connector in the Workflows Designer, the event that we want to add is an action. That makes it so it'll be listed as an action on that connector. And in here we have our connection object. We can add options that'll be prompted for when you actually add this connector to the workflow, and then any inputs that you might want to pass into it from maybe other parts in the workflow itself. In this case, we'll just add our relative URL with the API, do a get. And then again, maybe we want the status code for debugging purposes. Maybe we want the headers as well. But we definitely want the body because we're looking to get some data out of this. And for that, we will add some outputs. And this is what the connector action will return to us in the Workflow Designer. So we'll add a static group. You can add dynamic groups as well. Dynamic would be where you could select which outputs you'd actually want from that, but we'll go simple here. And we'll just call this a response. And maybe we call this users. And this is going to return a JSON object. And we have that there. We have our preview card. We'll show what the output will look like when in use in the Workflow Designer. So we'll save this. And we'll name this get users. We'll save the data there. Test it out real quick. And I think I forgot one thing. Got the field there, but what I need to do is drag the body from the HTTP response over to the outputs. And now if we test this, let's see, we got some data here. Got a user object. So Mr. Bernard Bush there, it's like. So now that we have our settings, any authentication that's required, we have some basic system flows in there, and we have our first action flow. What we'd want to do is deploy a test version of this. So we'd come over to the deployment tab here, click create test version, usually really quick. So we have our test version 1 here. And now we can go back to our Workflows Designer. And in here, we can see, okay, is this going to work within our Workflow Designer the way that we expect? To do that, we'd come over and say add app action. And we can see all our built-in application connectors here. We don't see, what would we call this one? We call this demo app. Yeah, we don't find it in there. And that's because right now all we have is a test version of this. So we need to click the include test connectors. And then now, if we hit demo, we can see our demo app. Another way to tell is it's prefixed by test, and any color scheme or icon that you have on there is going to be grayed out. So we can select this, and now we can see we have our get users action there. So typically you're going to build out a lot of different actions for the different API endpoints you might have there, but we've got our single action there, get users. Click that. It's going to ask me to create a new connection for this because the test connection we created over in Connector Builder those aren't available over in the workflow designer itself. Those are sandboxed in the connector builder to keep those separate. So I'll create a test connection. Again, nothing needed from the authentication standpoint, but create. And then we could run the whole thing there, but I'll just run a quick test just to make sure that it is working. And there we go. We have our first action on our first custom connector working over in Connector Builder. So usually what you'd want to do after you've made sure that this is working in the actual workflow designer is you can come back over to the deployment and you can deploy, click deploy version. And what this will do is it'll deploy a private version. So that will make it like a production version, I guess, of the connector over in Workflow Designer. So it'll show up in your connector catalog just like all the built-in connectors. Again, it'll be private to this specific Okta org that you've created and deployed it in. But at that point, it should be ready to go. And for any application vendors out there that are looking to build connectors and have those included in the workflow catalog for other connectors, that's where you could use this submit connector down at the bottom there. So once you've built it out, you can submit it. This is much easier than the old process of building workflow connectors. So now if we go back over here, we were to remove this, come back, add app action. Now we can see we have our demo app here without including test connectors because we've deployed a private version of this. So again, this should show up along with everything else we have in here. So we have it right there. So any questions yet, Max? Are we getting any questions? If not, I can go in and actually show how we would tweak this to add some authentication to it.
I see one question, Troy. Oh, actually, another one. All right, let's. Oh, and AJ from our support answered, so that's good. But yeah, let's just continue, and then we can look at questions.
Okay. AJ is the workflows guru, so hopefully he's keeping me honest there. All right. So let's say our demo app is like a typical. The application we're connecting to is like a typical application. And let me just make sure I got that removed over here. Okay. And it actually does require some form of authentication. We would need to make sure that we build that into the connector here and typically allow for end users that are going to be making use of this to enter the information to authenticate. So we'll come back into our demo app here, and I'll come down to the authentication section, and we're going to say, okay, this requires OAuth 2. And right now, as far as grant types go, authorization code is the only one that's supported here. I'm going to switch this connector rather than going against that random user API. I'm going to have this go against the Okta identity governance APIs. So what we'll do is we could add the base URL here, but I'll come back to that in just a second. We come down to the credentials section. Developer is selected by default, and that would mean that I would hard code the client ID and client secret in here as an application developer. And that would mean anybody that's making use of the connector, that connector is going to be making use of those. It'll be hidden from the end users, but they'll all be using the same client ID and client secret. Typically, if this is going to be something that's going to be private and just used within a single Okta org, that might be okay. But if this is going to be included in the Okta Workflows Connector catalog for other customers, you would want them to be able to provide their own client ID and client secret, and possibly some other information, if they have, separate endpoints or something. So what you would do is switch this from developer. So if you look over on the right, all it's prompting for is the connection nickname. So we'd switch this to customer, and what this does is now uses some variables in the client ID and client secret. We see a couple fields have been added here for those that would be filled out when somebody's making a new connection to this. And these are referenced from the parameters down here. So it pre-populated a couple there called client ID, client secret, with the keys of client underscore ID, client underscore secret. And those are both on the auth object. So auth.client ID, auth.client secret. We could expand on this by saying, okay, we want to know, I want to be able to connect to Okta Identity Governance, but maybe use this against different instances of that. So maybe I put Okta.org and use a key of Okta.org there. And now we have another field on here as well. We can use that within our base URL as well. So if I come up here, it's HTTPS auth.okta.org and OAuth 2. I believe that is the. I want to head you down the wrong path there. Let me just make sure I got the right OAuth 2 v1. Okay. OAuth 2 v1 is sort of the base path to our OAuth 2 authorization there. Authorize is the authorization path endpoint. And then we have token for the token path as well as the refresh path there. In order to make specific calls, we're going to have to add some different scopes here. So what I did, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but I just created an OIDC app over in Okta, and I granted a couple scopes to be able to do this. Obviously, if this is a different application out there with OAuth 2, there would be different scopes for the different things you need to do against that. But here I have a couple. So access requests, read, access certifications, read. I'll just add those here to my scopes. The governance. Okay. Okay, and then in order to be able to refresh your token, you need to include the offline access scope as well. So we have pretty much everything built out here as far as the authentication standpoint. We have our base URL, the authorization and token paths. We have our scopes, and hopefully I haven't misspelled anything in there. And then we have our parameters that are going to prompt the user to enter that when they're creating the connection there. One thing we would need to do is take this redirect URI. This would need to be copied over to whatever your OAuth endpoint is. So in this case, I'm talking back to this one here. So if this was being used against something like Salesforce or something like that, it'd be similar steps to add the redirect URI over on the OAuth side on Salesforce. We'll save that. And then coming back to our connector, we'll save that. And we'll have to adjust a couple things in the flows. In the helper flow, we now have some additional information down here in the connection. And the way that this works is we'd have to take the access token and pass that over in an authorization header. So what we would do there is we take the text concatenate card and build out the string in the format that's required for that authorization header. So bearer space, whatever the access token is. And then we would create an object construct with the key of authorization and that bearer token. And then if any other headers came in, we wouldn't want to lose those. So what we would do is we would merge. We'd take an object merge card, we'd merge our authorization header with whatever headers came in. Oops. And then those would be the headers that we would pass over to our request here. I'm going to change the URL because now we are dealing with the Okta identity governance rather than that public API there. So HTTPS, and then we have our Okta.org. And then the endpoint is believe it's Governance API. Governance API v1. And then whatever relative URL we passed into this request, and then that would over here. And I believe we should be good there. So we'll test this out. I'll create a different connection because now we're connecting to OIG. And that's where client ID and client secret from our application would come into play here. So I'll do that. And our secret. And of course, it's not working. I do see we are getting close to the end of time. So I did pre-build one here just so we could take a look at that. So again, building out the bearer string, putting it in an authorization header, merging that in. This is really where the difference would be compared to the no authentication. If we look at one with basic authentication, this is taking username and password. And really, again, the difference would be how you build out that authorization header. This would be just taking username, delimited password, base64 encoding that, put it in a basic auth header there, and passing that as the authorization header over. So most of everything else stays the same. It's just how do you handle the either the access token or the username and password, or in a custom authorization, maybe you're getting an API key. So this one, we just have one parameter for the API key, another for the org. And in the flows here, how is that being passed over? This is one that I built out to talk to Okta, which prefixes the API key with SSWS, and again, passes that in an authorization header, just like the others there. One thing that I didn't get to really touch on was the ability to provide inputs to your actions. So this one we're looking at right here, I added an option to put a limit value in there, build that out and pass it in as a query. So for different API endpoints, if there are things that you may want your users to set up when they're creating the connection, you could add those as options on the card. So if we take a look at the preview card over here, so this is what this option would look like. We put limit there. It's a drop down with a few different options here. We can see this is what the user would be prompted for when adding that connector to a workflow. Inputs could be the same way, where let's see if we've got one here. Actually, maybe back on this. Yeah, so here we have some inputs, a couple different fields here. Again, first we select our option, save that, and then now we have our input fields here. So within the workflow designer, these would be fields where you could pass data into that, and those would be used within the actions itself. And then similarly, we could do that with outputs. You know, what sort of output do you want from this? And then we kind of saw that before as well. So Max, I know we're about up on time here.
Yes.
There's a lot of information I was trying to fit in there, so hopefully I didn't go too fast or lose anybody. But any questions?
It was great. And again, there's a recording so people can watch it again if they missed something. Yeah, folks, post your questions. We might be able to answer one or two questions. So there's one question from Troy, which AJ, again, thank you for answering. So I'll just read the question. So can you build a connector in Okta preview environment and then import it into production? So the answer was not yet. So again, thank you, AJ. There's another question from Bram. Is that is a submit connector to Okta only for suppliers, or can other people also contribute?
Other people can contribute, I believe. I don't know if you have to have a formal vendor relationship with Okta. I'm not sure about that. But I mean, the option is there to submit it. It just, I mean, obviously, if this is an application that's not publicly available, you wouldn't want to do that, because otherwise customers could see it there, but they wouldn't actually be able to make use of it.
Very cool. Yeah, I don't see any more questions, but great. Thank you so much for joining us today. We should have you again soon.
It would be my pleasure.
Very cool.
Right.
I'll quickly. This is how I'll put this in the chat. This is how you can reach me if you have any questions. Great. I don't know what's the best way to reach out to you, or we can also include that information in the message that I'm going to be sending out. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think my email was on the first slide there.
Do you want to put it in the chat?
Yeah, I'll just get back to the chat screen there. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. This recently went GA, so I think some things might still change. I know there's new features and functions planning to be added, but this definitely streamlines and makes the process of building and submitting a connector a lot easier than it used to be. It actually makes it possible now for somebody outside of Okta to create a connector. So.
Cool. I see. I guess it's just a question if we have workflow swag.
I would love some of that too. So Max, if you know of any, let me know.
Yeah, I'll have to check. Yeah, I don't think we have anything sort of right now, but I'll check on that. One sort of little question or ask from me, if there are any topics that you want us to cover in the future, so please, feel free to email me, and then we'll schedule an event. But again, thank you everyone so much for joining us today, and great, thank you again. I think this was an awesome session. And again, we'll have you back soon.
Awesome.